Good afternoon or good evening. I am very excited to be with everyone today. This is Bassam Haddad. I am the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, and I am very excited to have with me my colleague, friend, and superb scholar who is a scholar of Middle East Studies and a well known scholar of Syria who will be joining us to discuss Syria's war economy and Reconstruction. I am very happy to welcome Samer Abboud. How are you, Samer?
Wonderful, Bassam. How are you?
I am teaching a class on Syria, and I've told everyone about you, but I didn't have to because they're reading your book and they love your work. Every time I teach a course on Syria, you are featured because of your lucid approach and the very informative chapters you have in your Syria book. So, welcome again. This is a Middle East and Islamic Studies podcast, as well as our events hub these days. So we are very excited to have you. I will say a few words about your bio, which you sent me, but it is actually a little bit modest and short. So I might add things. If you feel that I'm going too far, please stop me. Samer Abboud is Associate Professor of Global Interdisciplinary Studies at Villanova University and the author of Syria, his book titled Syria. He has published on contemporary Syria recently in journals such as Citizenship Studies, Peace Building, and the Journal of Intervention and State Building. Samer also is one of the co-editors of the Syria page on Jadaliyya. He is also the um, main organizer or one of a couple of main organizers of the Political Economy Summer Institute, which is being held at George Mason on June 4th, and has been doing this job for the past 5 years. So this is our fifth Political Economy Summer Institute that he is going to co-organize along with the Arab Studies Institute and the Political Economy Project. So please go to the politicaleconomyproject.org, the politicaleconomyproject.org, if you want to learn more about this. So without much more introduction, I would like to say a couple of things about this event. It's being co sponsored by the Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University. It is also co sponsored by the Shar School of Policy and Government. It's also co sponsored by Global Affairs. And we are very happy you are with us, Samer. I will recede into the background and give you the floor to address Syria's war economy and post war reconstruction, which is a very timely topic and has been for 2 3 years now after the cessation of the major hostilities in Syria and the return to a very problematic Syria because there's no normalcy in the sense that it is actually still a very devastating picture that one sees when they look at Syria. I'll let you do the rest of the talking, and we'll do about 35 minutes or so. And then if there are questions, we can field them and we'll let people continue with their day.
Thank you so much, Bassam. Thank you, of course, for the invitation. And thank you also for assigning my work in class. It always means a lot to me to hear that people are reading things that I've written. So thank you for doing that. Thank you to the students for reading it. I look forward to talking to you about it soon. Thank you to all the sponsors at George Mason for participating in this and for advertising it. And I'm really looking forward to this and looking forward to your questions and comments at the end. Prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the question of whether and how Syria could transition to a period of post-conflict reconstruction was at the forefront of international discussions about the future of the conflict. As early as 2013, international organizations had begun to produce policy prescriptions for what a post-conflict Syria could look like. As the conflict itself developed over the subsequent years, these plans adjusted to the new developments and to the new realities on the ground that shifted attention away from the inevitability of a reconstruction program that would be tied to a United Nations-led Geneva peace process towards questions of how reconstruction could be implemented with the Syrian regime still in power. This is precisely what Bassam was referring to a few minutes ago. The changing battlefield and geopolitics of the conflict has not prevented international interveners from wanting to use the language of a European Union official, be ready for the moment when Syrian reconstruction would happen. As such, since 2013, international interveners, who I take here to mean multilateral development agencies, aid ministries, international NGOs, and other actors like that, these interveners have produced volumes of what I call prefigurative reconstruction plans for Syria that reflect both a vision of what the conflict is, how it started, and what has happened over the last 10 years, and what a post-conflict Syria could look like. Bassam, could you please share the two quotes that are up? Thank you very much. Sorry to throw these up. This is the only thing that I'm going to be sharing today, I promise. Please take a minute. I know it's not the biggest font and maybe might not be so readable, but just take a second and go through these two quotes that I've placed up on the screen here, if you don't mind. These quotes represent the problem that I want to discuss with you today. More specifically, the problem of knowledge production around Syrian reconstruction. How do international interveners construct knowledge about Syria? Or more specifically, how do they diagnose Syria's problems? How does Syria's war economy fit into these prefigurative reconstruction plans? What are the empirical and the political bases of policy recommendations about Syria's reconstruction? The answer to these questions can, I think, I'm hoping at least, be found in the juxtaposition of these two quotes. On the left is a recommendation produced by the International Monetary Fund in 2006, 1 year after the Ba'ath Party had declared the adoption of the social market economy, a vague and ill-defined development strategy that was intended to shift Syria away from a planned economy and towards a more market-led development model that included deeper integration into regional and international economies, laws that would introduce flexibility into the labor markets, and the gradual withdrawal of subsidies. You know, we all recognize this as a kind of the neoliberal recipe for development. The important part here is that there was a particular diagnosis of the development needs of the Syrian economy that necessitated the recommendations that you're reading on the left. You'll notice that the passage on the right reads very similarly to that on the left. Interestingly, the passage on the right was also found in an IMF document about Syria that also contains a series of recommendations about economic policy. But this document was written in 2016, fully 10 years after the first report and 5 years after the conflict erupted. At this point, millions of Syrians had already been displaced, hundreds of thousands had been killed, and the country was mired in a political and military stalemate. Bassam, you can take that off now, if that's okay. While this is admittedly the most egregious example of the regurgitation of policy recommendations for post-conflict Syria, I take this to be indicative of a wider problem of knowledge production about Syria's reconstruction that collectively inform the prefigurative plans advanced by international interveners since 2013. My principal point today is that these prefigurative plans are not grounded in a specific reading of Syria's complicated conflict ontology, but rather in liberal ideas about how conflicts start, how they end, and how post-conflict countries can be reconstructed in the aftermath of civil violence. The diagnosis of the problem is based on a reading of the conflict. In the same way that the IMF's 2006 recommendations, those ones on the left, were rooted in assumptions about market-led development, the plans that I'm interested in talking about today are rooted in a liberal epistemology of conflict that sees reconstruction as a principally political problem about where authority lies in the post-conflict period and how that authority can enact liberal economic policies to provide a material corollary to a political solution or a reconstruction process, or reconciliation process, sorry. There is a major dilemma, however, in Syria, and this is also something that Bassam alluded to in the introduction. How do international interveners implement reconstruction plans and affect reconstruction outcomes in the absence of an internationally mandated political process? In the Syrian case, there is no international process that grants legitimacy either to the central state or to the interveners who come to effect reconstruction. In its place, a tripartite political process has emerged in which the energies of the three powers, the three Astana process powers, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, are more directed at the management of the battlefield, the preservation of regime power, and the fulfillment of these states' interests in a weakened Syria, and less so in any interest in pursuing a large-scale, let alone a liberal, economic reconstruction process. Yet, despite the absence of this, of a process of, I'm thinking here in terms of a political solution, political deliberation, negotiations between different parties, and so on. This is entirely absent in the Syrian case. And despite this, despite the absence of this process that could facilitate international intervention into Syria, international agencies, intervening agencies, have nevertheless continued to produce knowledge about Syria's conflict and its post-conflict needs. There's thus a misfit or a clash or an incompatibility or whatever we want to call it between the knowledge about Syria that appears in these plans and Syria's conflict ontology, or what's happening on the ground. Syria's specific conflict landscape requires reconstruction thinking inclusive of the major problems liberal interveners are unaccustomed to facing: the absence of a peace process, a regime staying in power, an alternative model of conflict management that has emerged that actively sidelines the United Nations, the persistence of violence, and so on. Yet, what I found in my collective reading of these documents is that the plans treat Syria as they would any other conflict situation without reference to these broader kind of trends, if you will, or broader features of the conflict. In particular, these plans revolve around the idea of localism, or the idea that reconstruction should target local centers of power at the expense of the central state. The so-called local turn in international intervention argues that decades of post-conflict and peace-building failures can partly be attributed to policies that empowered federal authorities in ways that perpetuated conflict patterns. That is to say that interventions did not alleviate the conditions of conflict, but actually aggravated them. Going local, so to speak, has been articulated as a remedy to these problems and as a way for interveners to circumvent state power. It's no surprise then that in the case of Syria, the dilemma of how to enact and influence reconstruction while the regime is still in power has given impetus to the localism strategy within reconstruction thinking. Since the end of the Cold War, localism has emerged as a strategy pursued by interveners to support and vest power in post-conflict situations in all things we would call local. This strategy seeks to ground policies in local knowledge, local actors, to produce local results. These are the kinds of vocabularies that are used to refer to these plans, or to this strategy, I'm sorry. The idea behind this strategy is to promote decentralization as a way to foster peace and to ensure the buy-in of reluctant populations. If power and resource could be vested in local authorities, say provincial governments, municipalities, or anything that wasn't the central state, people would be more likely to support peace and reconstruction efforts. So these are what the proponents of localism have been arguing for many years, that this is why we should support localism as an intervention strategy. At its inception, localism was considered to be a radical departure from the universalist, top-down approaches to reconstruction normally advanced by international interveners, who had been principally concerned with ensuring that a strong central state could avoid a relapse into civil conflict. Localism was to kind of de-universalize intervention then, and it rejected, at least the idea was, that it would reject the objectification of conflict zones by contextualizing policies, contextualizing knowledge in local patterns of power. Localism was to orient interveners around the specifics of conflict and to make interveners more responsive to Reconstruction needs. In the Syrian case, however, localism as a set of policy recommendations is not emerging as a response to, I believe, a specific reading of Syria's conflict ontology. Rather, I believe that the deployment of localism as a framework serves to reproduce liberal visions of power and authority in post-conflict zones, rather than situating knowledge about Syria within the conflict ontology. For me, the problem here is a simple one of legibility, or how interveners render conflicts such as Syria's as legible. That is, they need to know what they are dealing with, what is at stake, what they want to do, and so on. And there's a kind of consistent vocabulary that parallels a consistent set of policy recommendations. And all of these things seem to kind of exist in the same discursive, like an ecosystem. A conflict looks a particular way, therefore it needs particular solutions. And I believe that Reconstruction thinking around Syria has largely followed this pattern. One of the principal methods through which these plans produce legibility is through a very obvious lessons learned framework, in which a pedagogy of conflict determines prefigurative plans based on experiences elsewhere. That is, many of these interveners draw lessons about Syria based on things that went wrong elsewhere. This is popular, I believe, in some Canadian government documents. And there was this big report by the Canadian Finnish governments in conjunction with the United Nations Development Program that argues for localism as the outcome of a lessons learned approach. What's consistent in these plans, I'm just using this one as an example, there are many, many others. What is consistent in these plans is the reliance on past experiences of interveners and how these experiences, not the actual conflicts themselves, determine how future intervention should take place. This comparative approach to Syrian reconstruction produces a pedagogy of conflict in which conflict trajectories are read through specific questions and cases, not through anything happening in Syria. As one can imagine, the lessons learned arguments are drawn from places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Lebanon, and Algeria. A more common approach to prefigurative plans is to centralize the question of authority and power as the principal problem of reconstruction. So the idea here is that if you address the question of where power resides, who has the authority to enact reconstruction, that everything will flow from that. So there's a lot of emphasis on questions of centralized or decentralized power. The RAND Corporation has regularly advocated for the devolution of power to local authorities. This was first in a 2016 report. In a 2017 report, the emphasis was on decentralization. And in a 2018 report, the language had changed to emphasize bottom-up approaches. Collectively, the RAND had produced, it's called Peace Plan for Syria reports. These reports collectively imagine localism as a response to decades of a highly centralized state. Since 2015, these reports have been published and offer something of a window on the evolution of localism in the Syrian case, sort of advocating the same thing but using different language. In the second report published in 2016, that I briefly referred to earlier, the authors advocated for localism as actually the basis of a political settlement in which the composition and authority of the central government may be contested. By 2018, however, the authors were advocating that international interveners make support conditional on the regime's acceptance of, quote, community by community intervention that could foster a, quote, bottom-up political process that could help consolidate the peace, reduce the regime's reliance on Russia and Iran, and make the reemergence of a terrorist movement less likely, end quote. Localism is advanced in these documents as both a solution to regime power while also being conditional upon it. A window into what localism may look like, I think, is offered by the UNDP's quote unquote localization activities that aim to ground certain capacities in local centers of power. As the most active international agency in Syria, UNDP has contributed millions of aid dollars to local reconstruction projects. This ranges from everything from debris cleaning to cultural heritage protection. These interventions are framed as localizing by fostering community, quote unquote, resilience and increasing local capacities. As the most active agency in Syria, the possibilities and limitations of localism are apparent in the UNDP's programming. As the UNDP itself readily admits, all interventions are dependent on regime approval, if not the active participation of state institutions. We see similar recommendations throughout the kind of reconstruction landscape from the Atlantic Council, Chatham House, Carnegie, and so on. I think that Samer Batrawi accurately captures the problem that I'm interested in here with reference to her own reading of European documents about Syrian reconstruction. When she says that, or when she argues, that Europeans and other donors have simply failed to define what is meant by both inclusivity and all Syrians, ubiquitous terms that saturate public donor discourse about Syrian reconstruction. What does the local mean in the Syrian context? And how can interveners account for the kinds of pluralities that exist on the local level that we know about in Syria, that there is no sort of alternative centers of power that are autonomous from any of the armed groups, let alone autonomous from any of the larger foreign intervening powers. So what does it mean to talk about localism in this context? And so we should consider, obviously, the question of what is happening in Syria, but also what research tells us about other contexts in which local interventions aim to empower these supposed or magical autonomous centers of power. What I get out of this research and this reading of Syria is that not only are there a kind of plurality of centers of power, different centers of power throughout the country, but that what is local is not always what is liberal. So there's actually a lot of evidence from previous cases, I believe in Sri Lanka, especially, where interveners actually refused to work with groups because they did not consider them sufficiently liberal. The prefigurative reconstruction plans for Syria remove the conflict from its social and geopolitical context and fail to capture how the transformative effects of war are shaping Syria's post-conflict order. The wartime transformations wrought by violence, displacement, and most importantly, enmity, the continuation of enmity, have reconfigured the state in profound ways. Liberal peace interventions in post-war reconstruction peripheralize such transformations, instead advancing approaches of creative destruction that seek to construct anew the political and economic systems of war-torn countries, rather than address the transformative impacts of war. Syrian state transformation during the war occurred in part through the reorientation of economic activity to serve the needs of the battlefield. At this point, 10 years into the conflict, and with no real end in sight, it may no longer be appropriate to speak of a Syrian war economy or war economies as some sort of deviation from a norm, but rather as the norm, as something that may be difficult, if not impossible, to meaningfully roll back, especially in this context. It is thus, for me at least, from the outside, difficult to overestimate the extent to which the whole of Syria's economy and individual livelihoods are shaped by the war today and in the future. This brings me to the question of Syria's war economy or war economies. I'd like to suggest that there's a sort of permanence at this point to the war economies, that it's become a part of everyday life for Syrians, for the armed groups, for business people, for state institutions, and the everydayness of how people and institutions and the state and armed groups, how they navigate this everydayness is shaping any prospects for Syria's reconstruction. Without getting too much into it because of the limitations of time, I'd like to suggest that there are three principal forms of activity that bring us from the level of the individual to the state that are shaping Syria's war economy. The first is the practice of intermediation. The second is that of extraction. And the third, and I think for the question of reconstruction, the most important, sanctions evasion by the state, by state institutions, and by conflict elites. Intermediation here is very important because we can think of it in terms of the state trying to make international payments, but we can also think about it in terms of how people have to pay for information or pay for resources or pay to get out of the country. These sort of brokerage practices that have taken root in the country. There's actually a very interesting article recently that was done on the economy around knowledge of prisoners and people who are in prison. And this practice of intermediation, I think at least over time, is what has given rise to a conflict elite that served a function to intermediate between the state and the outside world. The second activity, extraction, refers to things as kidnapping, looting, taxation, informal taxation by the armed groups, this sort of really short-term, unsustainable activity that is completely dependent on violence. That is, people, armed groups are able to extract resources from populations, from each other, through the use of violence. And then, of course, what I think is most consequential on the question of reconstruction is how state institutions have been reoriented around both sanctions evasion and the appropriation and redistribution of Syrians' property and assets. There is, in fact, what we might call a political process occurring in Syria. It is certainly what the regime calls it. There are now new state institutions dedicated to the creation of memories around the conflict. The specific project is, I'm blanking on it now, but this is actually run by, I believe, Luthaina Sha'ban. And there's this general discourse, if you will, that the regime is engaging in a process to reconcile with the population. And that specific language of reconciliation is, for anyone who has been following the events in Syria, knows that reconciliation, musallaha is the word, or sorry, the term that is used to the process, I'm hearing myself talk and it's distracting me a little bit. Reconciliation is the term that is used to refer to the process by which the state offers armed groups amnesty and sort of reintegration into the army or the counterinsurgency apparatus. But there's also a process that the state has initiated called a settlement process, in which it is asking Syrians, specifically those outside of the country, to settle their status with the state. That is to prove to the state through a questionnaire. It's a 4-page questionnaire. It is submitted often at the border. They're presented in batches to settlement committees that exist in different parts of the country. The settlement committees are made up of party officials, local elites, police, so on. And they decide whether somebody is essentially allowed entry into the country. And of course, this is a way to bifurcate society from the loyal and the disloyal for those who are outside, but there are also similar processes for people who are inside of the country. Military desertion now is considered a crime akin to terrorism, and there are all sorts of other crimes, mostly related to absenteeism, that allow the state to appropriate the property of Syrians, that allow the state to essentially eliminate someone's opportunity to have a bank, to own property, or sorry, to have a bank account, to own property, to work in Syria, and so on and so on. And the state has actually reoriented many of its existing institutions around this process of settlement, appropriation, and redistribution of property and assets. These patterns that I'm referring to here are the patterns of appropriation and settlement constitute for many, I think, within the regime, constitute a reconciliation process. There's, of course, the reconciliation process with the armed groups and the settlement process as well. But what we're seeing here out of these two processes is a sort of tethering of a legal economic structure that, the tethering of citizenship and economic rights, where people's citizenship is essentially under attack and being undermined by the regime in the name of reconciliation and peace. These realities suggest that alternative approaches to post-conflict reconstruction that bring together, suggest alternative approaches to post-conflict reconstruction that bring together a politics of exclusion with an attendant political economy. Liberal intervention, to return to this problem, envisions a political economy of post-conflict reconstruction that enforces power sharing and institutional development through the market. Inclusive power sharing mirrors distributional efforts to channel resources to communities in an effort to materially sustain peace. In Syria, however, the new models of peacemaking that seek to sustain enmity through a political economy of exclusion that actively diverts resources away from needed areas and vulnerable populations. We can call this whatever we want, illiberal, authoritarian, hybrid peace, or whatever else. But the important part here is that the conduct of war and the management of conflict by the Syrian regime and the tripartite powers are consequential on the forms of post-conflict order that are emerging. I've tried in my remarks today to turn our attention to the need to integrate and interrogate this order more thoroughly in our discussions of reconstruction. So to conclude, my principal concern today was the extent to which Syria's post-conflict order is reflected in the knowledge production about Syria's prefigurative reconstruction plans. The strategy of localism that saturates these plans is one focused on the question of authority and how decision-making should be concentrated outside of the state in the reconstruction period. That is fine and all, but we must recognize that this analysis flows from liberal ideas and not Syria's conflict ontology, which is being shaped by four larger processes that I have tried to briefly identify today and that maybe can be the basis of our discussion after. First, the structure of Syria's war economies and the roles that intermediation, extraction, and sanctions evasion play in the constitution of those war economies. Second, the Astana process, a tripartite process that has actively supplanted the Geneva process and that is geared around the management of the Syrian battlefield. Third, the absence of a comprehensive vision, let alone funding for a reconstruction plan that is emerging from within Syria or from within the regime's allies. And finally, the emergence of a regime-led political process aimed at so-called reconciliation that is aggravating the miseries, catastrophes, and forms of exclusion created by the war. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Samer. This has been very informative. I thank you for your participation, and I thank you for being able to share with us a, very important aspect of your research. I would like to, at this point, ask you to share with us a little bit before we actually move to. Let me see if we don't seem to have a lot of questions, but we can take questions so long as people can add their name and affiliation, or identify themselves. We don't intend to sort of take names like that, but if you can tell us a little bit about, in your view, what would it take for a development in Syria that would, on the one hand, compensate people for their losses, and on the other, provide them with some sort of a pathway back home? We are talking about 6 million refugees or so outside the country, and a close amount inside the country. I mean, besides all of the lofty and really ambitious goals of having democracy of sorts, or having some sort of a free Syria, a totally free Syria, how do we start there? What would it take?
Those are great questions. Of course, the preface to the questions uh, is that there's nothing to suggest that the Syrian regime would want to engage in any meaningful process that would provide the economic, let alone the political conditions for people to return. If people have to engage in a settlement process to return to the country and they receive settlement papers, that's not a permanent pass. Unfortunately, what we hear from Syria is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are getting arrested even after going through the settlement process. So I think to answer the second question, there would need to be, I believe, a guarantee, strong guarantees, that when people returned, they would not be subject to the violence of the state. And I simply don't see how that could happen. Recently, Syria's terrorism laws have changed, and there are new terrorism courts that replace the emergency courts, and they're actually growing. There are more and more of these courts and more of these judges who sit on the courts. And there are now citizen-led denunciation practices that are actively encouraged by the state. And I believe that the effect of all of this is to create uncertainty and insecurity. So rather than providing protections for people, the definition of terrorism has now been extended to include anything from a Facebook post to shooting, and everything in between. So if you are somebody who in 2014 liked something on Facebook or shared something, or who had a few months where you were vocal, um, I can't imagine that you would not be living in a state of perpetual uncertainty and insecurity, knowing that any day of the week, somebody from your family or somebody else, somebody you know, somebody who doesn't like you or like your family, could report you as under this new terrorism law. And you would be one of the problems is that a kind of a legal process is initiated as soon as somebody is reported. So the political conditions for return, I think, are more, if not, or yeah, I think they're more important than the um, the question of where are people returning to, what homes, what jobs, things of that nature. Uh, when I have so the research for this specific talk involved talking with some Syrian economists, and one thing that there's sort of consensus around this idea that there was no money for reconstruction, and that many people within the regime believed that this was something that Russia and Iran and maybe a few other countries would contribute to. And I think what we're seeing is actually the opposite of, there actually is a compensation process, but from what I gather, this is only directed at people who are considered to be, the language that we use is loyalists and from loyalist areas. So what's actually happening is a lot of people who are making compensation claims are in some ways flagging themselves and putting themselves at risk for having their property appropriated. So I think all that's to say that the economic conditions for the compensation of Syrian loss, a number we can't possibly come up with, there's simply no movement on that front. I don't think that it's not really on offer, and what is on offer is very limited, and very much about the regime's desire, I think, to continue the politics of enmity that developed during the war into the post-war period.
Thank you, Samer. I'm going to ask you a question which is totally unfair. And no, it's not one of those questions that we cannot, you know, talk about openly. It's on topic. So basically, what, in your view, um, would it take for a robust, democratic, inclusive, and most importantly, independent opposition movement to re-emerge in Syria today or in the coming 5 years? And that's why
Uh,
it's not fair, because it's not an easy question, but this is the $1 million question. The situation in Syria is horrific, including
mm,
for former supporters of the regime, whether direct supporters or supporters in terms of the lesser evil approach. Even those categories have been speaking out in the past year or two, actually, but definitely the past year, against the regime's inability to restore normalcy in so many ways, economically and beyond. And of course, everyone else is already ready to act, except that the war has taken its toll. So what would it take for this sort of opposition to emerge? Not the opposition that is exclusionary, not the opposition that is dependent on particular countries outside Syria that have their own interests in Syria, which is one of the reasons the revolution, the uprising, the protests lost steam or were counterproductive in some senses because of those views. But an opposition that is inclusive, democratic, and independent.
that is a really great question that I suspect will. Yeah, it is unfair. You're right, but it's a great question. So I'll take a stab at it. I was gonna take the route and say the principal condition is autonomy from outside powers. I think, and this is certainly the problem that plagued the opposition very early on in the uprising. If I could use an anecdote to hopefully answer your question, I do believe that, I mean, of course, the regime's power is not total, and the regime is, if we can attribute personhood to the regime for the sake of conversation, the regime has. Um, I think you're right about the criticism that is emerging from within Syria that is somehow not related at all to this opposition movement that emerged when the conflict began. And my sense from, and this is anecdotal, of course, is that there is some uh, movement within Syria to bring in, to listen to, to engage with people that remained in the country or who left and came back, who are not, if you will, tainted with the association of the external opposition. And I do think on some level this is a political inevitability, because the regime can't possibly continue to govern through these practices of enmity. They can't continue to govern through practices of housing appropriation and this kind of large-scale denunciation and imprisonment of people. So I do think at some point the regime will need to recruit, or at least recruit's not the right word. The regime will need to incorporate elements of Syrian society that perhaps a few years ago they did not consider to be loyal or loyal to the state. And at which point that political calculation emerges, I'm not sure, but I do think, again, anecdotally, I know that there was a lot of information sharing between local, like I know in healthcare, for example, a lot of like immunizations and pediatric visits and things like this. I know that many of the areas that came back under regime control, there was cordial transfer of information, of patient records, things like that. I do believe the same thing was happening with children's school records. I do know that, again, this is anecdotal, of course, but that there's a growing movement around housing and property to work on establishing ownership, to somehow sifting through this maze of legality that determines Syrian home ownership in order to, to speak to your first question, to facilitate the repatriation of the millions of people who have been outside. So there are things happening, but I don't believe that I don't believe that the calculus is such now that we're going to see the emergence, even in parliament or something like that, of autonomous political movements. The final thing I'll say is that there has been, I know this is a common word to say, and it's a bit weird to say after I've just criticized the use of common words, but there's been a lot of learning, I think, that has happened over the course of the last 10 years that may shape that question of autonomous democratic movements in Syria as well.
Thank you, Samer. I'm very excited that we actually had this opportunity to speak with you. So many people would love to hear from you because of your book and because of your constant production of knowledge on Syria. And I am glad that we were able to capture this. And I understand that you recently wrote a piece in a publication. Can you tell us a little bit about this before we release you?
Sure. Thank you.
No, I'm saying release you, نطلق سراحك, because we're talking about Syria.
There are two pieces that most of my remarks today were based on. The first was a piece in citizenship studies that came out about a year ago that was asking the question of how post-conflict citizenship is emerging in Syria, how the regime is constructing notions of post-conflict citizenship through the settlement process. So this thing where I kind of went off the cuff and was discussing how the regime intends to repatriate Syrians and how it intends to subject people to a kind of political loyalty test, and how that continues, actually deepens the politics of exclusion that has governed the last 10 years I think, by from the regime. And the second piece was in the Journal of Intervention and State Building, and it's a more sophisticated and deeper dive into this question of what English language reconstruction plans, how they imagine a post-conflict Syria. And I will say that the motivation for that paper, and certainly the motivation for this talk, was in my interest in reading anything that came out that was trying to imagine what Syria's post-conflict reconstruction would look like. And my noticing that there's a kind of consistent vocabulary that was used, and that vocabulary did not always cohere with what I was seeing in my own research and in my own work on Syria, and certainly not in what I was seeing developing in the citizenship studies paper. I have a third piece that just came out in the Journal of Peace Building, which I also drew on a bit here, and that is looking at the question of the Astana peace process and what that means for the Geneva process in Syria, what it means for this idea of peacemaking in Syria, and how peace can be brought about through the negotiation of the tripartite powers.
Thank you very much for this, and I'm going to post a link to your book. We have two. If you can give 2 minutes to a question that
Yep.
was received after we sort of kind of moved on. It basically says, "I took my glasses to see, and it got worse. This is what happens when time takes its toll." Um, So basically, the question says, I don't understand how they can use this localism discourse when the regime has done everything in its power to destroy any local and regional um, structures which could serve the functions which the development donors wish. It's ludicrous. It's again, as usual, discourse for the outside world to rack up the likes and approval of the outside world, but ultimately will do nothing for the people of Syria, which is the theme in everything that has to do, with Syria. The idea that the Syrian citizens have been the principal victim and orders of magnitude beyond anything else here, and they continue to be the party paying the highest price, and we're talking about literally almost all Syrian citizens. So if you can take just 2 minutes, because we have to wrap up before 6.
Sure. Thank you. That's a really great question. This is one of
Let
the
me
things
let
that
me
I
just say
argue in.
1 second. I apologize, Samer.
Okay.
It's by Rissie Burt, Rissie Burt. Just to be clear, it was this person who asked this question.
Thank you. It is a really good question, because and I talk about that a bit in the article, because this idea of localism is romantic in a way. It assumes that there are these autonomous centers of power that exist that we haven't seen yet. And what we know from research on these localized interventions is that when interveners go into these places, what constitutes the local is significantly more complicated than what they imagined before they went in. More specifically, there are multiple centers of power that come together, that negotiate things, and so on. And in the case of Syria, you would be very hard pressed to find one of those centers of power that was not significantly influenced by the regime or an outside power. And so it does make the discourse of localism very interesting and suspect, and it's certainly what motivated this specific work of mine. I will say very briefly at the end that there is really good knowledge production that is emerging from collective Syrian networks. The National Agenda for the Future of Syria has produced excellent work, and I know that the people involved with that, I believe, are really caught between a rock and a hard place, but nevertheless producing excellent knowledge about what Syria that is actually grounded in what the Syrian in the Syrian experience or the Syrian experiences, and certainly the Syrian Center for Policy Research, both networks of which base their research on knowledge produced from within the country. And I think that's really important to note as well.
Thank you, Samer. Thanks to all who have joined us. We have a pretty sizable audience, people coming in and out, though, which is, to be expected, especially at this time. It's a very tough time of the semester, and yet we were able to have a really good um, showing. And I am very happy you were able to take time off from your teaching and your duties and obligations to join us. uh, Again, I added in the feed the link to your book, and your bio is also in the feed for those who would like to learn more. This particular talk will also be available at the MEIS Facebook, Middle Eastern Islamic Studies Facebook page, at facebook.com/GMUMEIS, as well as on Jadaliyya's Facebook page and jadaliyya.com as well. Um, Thank you again, Samer. And if you don't have any closing statements, we hope to see you again. And I look forward to seeing you soon at the Political Economy Summer Institute in June.
Thank you so much, Bassam. Thank you to everyone who took time out of the day to come. I appreciate it very much.
Shukran, Habibi. Salam.
Thank you. Thank you.